My name is Douglas Ehrman. I'm a former investment fund manager from Minneapolis, Minnesota. I was once responsible for a client portfolio of $100 million, and I was on a team that managed over $1.5 billion in assets. What I'm trying to say is I've been on the inside of how big money acts, thinks, and breathes. That's why I made this video, because the risks you face have never been greater. If you will give me a few minutes, I will explain how the world's financial system is about to collapse, and why the Federal Reserve and the U.S. government will not do anything to stop it, and why in the next 12 months, responsible middle-class families with money will be the main victims, thanks to a new Federal Reserve-created shadow export hardly anyone's talking about, and why 99 out of 100 people out there are completely unprepared for what's coming. Are you one of them? Let me ask you a question. Do you have a pension plan? Do you have an investment portfolio? Do you have life insurance? How about money invested directly or indirectly in U.S. government bonds? If you do, it's incredibly important you listen to this message and protect yourself and your family. I'll explain how in a moment. It's hard to avoid investing in treasuries. U.S. government bonds are the foundation of our economic and financial system. They're our bank's biggest assets. They're the biggest single asset in foreign central banks, too. China, for example, holds $895.6 billion in U.S. Treasury debt. Japan holds $877 billion. And if you own stock in a corporation, U.S. Treasury bonds are likely the corporation's major financial asset. They are what insurance companies rely on to cover their commitments. There are 4.3 trillion of them outstanding, the biggest single financial instrument in the entire world. U.S. Treasury bonds are also the only assets of America's Social Security system. Without the value in those bonds, Social Security would have nothing to draw on to pay benefits. Now imagine what happens if bonds lose their value. The Social Security system savings in U.S. bonds would suddenly disappear. The system would have no money to pay retirees. You'd have as many as 50 million older Americans mad as hell, many of them desperate, and some of them going hungry. It can't happen. It won't happen. Instead, the government will just take money from the general fund, right? But wait, if the value of Treasury bonds goes down, investors will turn against them, and if no one wants to buy them, how could the U.S. finance its deficits, a record $1.37 trillion this year alone? This year, the government will spend about $1.80 for every dollar it collects in taxes. Where does the extra 80 cents come from? It's borrowed by selling U.S. Treasury bonds to investors. But if investors can't trust U.S. Treasury bonds to hold their value, they'd stop buying them. This would mean the U.S. would have to live only on what it could raise in taxes. It would have to balance the budget. This would force it to cut spending by as much as 45%. How much is that? It's more than the entire Pentagon budget, and more than the entire discretionary spending budget for education, housing, police, border controls, health research, everything. Well, it's actually more than the Pentagon budget and the domestic discretionary budget put together. The only thing it's not more than is the entitlement budget, where you find popular programs such as Social Security and Medicare. In other words, if the federal government was suddenly forced by lenders to balance its budget, it would face a terrible choice. Either it cuts out most of Social Security and Medicare, or no more food stamps, no more aid to education, stop building on infrastructure programs, and no more defense spending. Are you starting to see that this is not just a regular financial problem? 41 million Americans live on food stamps. 51 million depend on Social Security. Over 4 million count on welfare payments. 43% of Americans are broke and spend more than they make. And 2.15 million are directly on the federal government payroll. If these payments stop, they will be hell to pay. No government could survive. No politician could possibly stay the course. That's why it won't happen. It will be worse. Far worse. Every economy eventually has a financial crisis. Some take longer to arrive than others, but there are no exceptions. If you live in the U.S., you probably feel protected from such problems. The U.S. has been at war several times. It's had a few stock market crashes and a Great Depression, but the country hasn't had a really bad financial crisis in more than 150 years. During the Civil War, northern states borrowed money and printed greenbacks. In all, Northerners brought almost $2 billion worth of Treasury notes and absorbed $700 million of new currency. Prices on everything doubled. 200% inflation. It was worse in the South. The South didn't have a sophisticated railroad system, heavy industry, or access to capital, and it needed money to fight the war. So it started printing money, not backed by gold or silver, which led to massive bouts of inflation. Prices rose 1,300% in just 3 years. By the end of the war, inflation had reached a point where the value of the Confederate currency was virtually zero. Over 600,000 died. Billions in lost economic growth resulted. But that was long ago. So let's look at something more recent. Take Britain, for example. In 1900, she was the world's sole superpower. But by the 1970s, Britain couldn't even afford to keep the lights on. You see, in the mid-1970s, Britain suffered from a stagflation similar to what happened in the U.S. at that time. But it was much worse in Britain. Trade union strikes were commonplace. Prices were rising. Everyone needed more money. Coal powered much of the nation's industry. When the coal miners went on strike, it looked as though the country was doomed. The government reacted with a 3-day work week. Industry only had enough power to work 3 days of the week. The rest of the time, workers shivered in the dark at home. To save electricity, the government ordered TV stations to go dark at 10:30 p.m. People still remember going from store to store to buy candles, and that the stores were out of them. In 1975, consumer prices rose 26%. Think about that a minute. A quarter of the nation's savings was wiped out in 1 year, and there were 4 more years to go before the economy hit bottom. Stocks, real estate, and savings, all of Britain's wealth, was marked down to a fraction of its former value. UK equities lost 73% of their value in 1973-74. And that wasn't all. Desperate for money, the UK raised the top income tax rate to 98%, and even seemingly well-off stockbrokers had to take second jobs to get by. And thousands of rich Englishmen left the country, including John Lennon and even the Rolling Stones. The country became known as Sick Man of Europe. Other nations spoke of getting the English disease, and this was the country that ruled half the world at the turn of the century. The fact is, financial crises are cyclical. Rich countries, poor countries, no country escapes them forever. But this is the first time something like this has happened to America, and when it does, people will be devastated. Wealth, even modest sums that have been carefully saved over decades, will suddenly vanish. People will feel cheated or worse, and it has to do, in part, due to the new Federal Reserve shadow export, as I like to call it, that's slowly creeping out and will smother our great country as we know it. But let me stop right here and tell you directly the coming crisis won't affect everyone equally. That's why the government will not stop this crisis, and why it will be much worse than Britain's 1970s experience, or any financial crisis experienced in the U.S. ever. I'm sending this message to you to warn you. The government won't take those necessary steps to make this problem go away, because it doesn't really want this problem to go away at all. In fact, to many people, in and out of government, it's the best news they've heard in years. Look, the average voter is deep in debt. 1 of every 4 voters is underwater on their mortgages. Many are up to their ears in credit card debt. The others live hand-to-mouth, counting on government programs like food stamps or unemployment insurance to keep their head above water. The U.S. federal government and state and local governments, too, are in the same boat. They're deep in debt. And politicians think this shadow export will actually help them. State and local governments' unfunded pension funds alone come to $1 to $4 trillion, according to Forbes. The U.S. government, meanwhile, has unfunded obligations in its Social Security and Medicare programs of an astounding $50 trillion. In short, U.S. debtors want to lighten their loads. How? By inflating these heavy debts away. You've heard the stories of Germany's terrible hyperinflation of the 1920s. Well, the important thing to remember is that there were winners and losers. Middle-class savers were wiped out, but people with a lot of debt came out ahead. In 1923, one man from Hamburg is said to have paid off the mortgage of his house by sending the bank a postage stamp, and he asked for change. That's why the Federal Reserve is actively printing up billions of extra dollars behind the scenes at the rate of about $3 billion every 24 hours. And creating a punishing shadow export that will affect everyone in the U.S., in Europe, in the Middle East, and in Asia. These people are in debt. The government is in debt. Almost everyone is in debt. Money printing leads to inflation, and everybody who is in debt wants inflation. And that's the shadow export I mentioned earlier, inflation. Not only will this inflationary menace affect you, your family, and your friends, it affects everyone in the world. That's because of the role the Fed plays in world economics. Billions printed here at home seeps out in a world economy like radiation after a nuclear meltdown. And unprepared middle-class savers everywhere will be wiped out sick from this cancer. This is not a small problem, is what I'm trying to say. Rather than take a hard look at itself, the U.S. government and the Federal Reserve are pussyfooting around the whole issue of cutting its deficits, unwilling to take the hard measures necessary to avoid disaster. And shocking as this may sound, it's why the common man on the street is letting the federal government get away with it. He wants inflation too. He's got bills to pay, including his mortgage. After 60 years of credit expansion, he's up to his eyeballs in debt, just like the government itself. He'd like a little inflation to make the debt easier to pay. And the poor? They just want the checks, food stamps, and benefits to continue. They've got nothing to lose from inflation, and a lot to lose if the federal government tries to balance its budget. This message is not for them, it's for you. If you are a head of a household, if you want to build and preserve money for your family, if you want to prosper like the rich, while most investors are getting killed, if you want to protect your money from inflation, defaults, crashes, if you're the sort of person I think you are, I want to warn you before it's too late, and show you how to protect yourself. The financial catastrophe that is coming is far worse than most people imagine. It's not a matter of a gentle rise in inflation that eases debt burdens. Instead, it's a matter of national bankruptcy, with collateral damage that could increase the jobless rate to twice or 3 times what it is today. Imagine even more people out of work with no prospect for the future. Devastate people living on Social Security or other fixed incomes. They will be desperately poor, even unable to feed themselves. Leave most middle-class Americans penniless. But don't worry about the rich. If they're smart, they'll survive, and even prosper. You see, the rich are different. They've already figured out what is going on. They've already taken the necessary precautions, not only to protect their wealth, but to use the coming crisis to add to it. That's why they're rich. They figure these things out. I should know. I was on the inside for a long time, managing money for the rich in Minnesota. In fact, many of them are looking forward to the crisis too. They think it will make them richer, and they're probably right. Most people don't remember this, but during the worst financial breakdown in modern history, which took place in Europe 88 years ago, most people were completely wiped out. It was not unusual for a former general or college professor to have to go through piles of trash in order to find something to eat. The currency was worthless. If you had saved money, or you depended on a salary, or you had a pension or an income from bonds, or practically anything else, in effect you had no money at all. Not enough to eat, not enough to pay rent, not enough to buy things or travel. People were desperate. Young men joined gangs and fought in the street. Young women from good families became prostitutes to earn a little foreign money. And this was in Europe's richest, most technologically advanced, and most dynamic economy. In GDP terms, only the U.S. was bigger. Yet the local currency was worthless, so people were desperate for real money. If you had been an American living there at the time, you could have lived like a king. For a few $100s, you could have bought almost any building in town, or almost any company, or almost anything you saw. Leopold Ulstein, a publisher, wrote that during this crisis, an American traveler passing through tipped their cook $1, and because $1 American was a huge sum of money at the time, the family had a meeting and decided that a trust fund should be established with the cook as the beneficiary, and the dollar invested by the bank's professional money managers. Imagine starting a trust fund with $1. But at the same time, it was also not unusual for some people to get rich. At the bottom, for example, the entire Daimler-Mercedes Auto Company, one of the world's leading automakers, was sold for the price of just 227 cars. And this was when General Motors was valued at a price equivalent to about 250,000 cars. But more often than not, most common people suffered. Take Walter Levy's dad, for example. My father was a lawyer and had taken out an insurance policy in 1903, and every month he had made payments faithfully. It was a 20-year policy, and when it came due, he cashed it in and bought a single loaf of bread. Why am I telling you these things? To scare you? Not at all. Just the opposite. I'm bringing you a message of hope. I know more or less how these episodes of financial madness work. I know how to protect myself. I know how to use crisis to increase wealth, and that's why I'm sharing them with you in this video. Of course, the country I was referring to earlier was Germany in the 20s, but what would that have to do with America in the 2010s? I'll put it to you simply. From time to time, every financial system gets itself in trouble. Every one, no exceptions. It was the Germans' turn in the 1920s, Britain's turn in the 1970s, and it's our turn now. As I said, we're not the first, and we won't be the last. It happened to France in 1720, for example. In 1715, the country's economy was in trouble, so the Royal Bank began to issue more paper money than it had in hard coinage. This led to the Mississippi Bubble. The result? Inflation surged, the Royal Bank collapsed, and the value of currency had to be cut in half. Imagine what you would do if you logged on tomorrow and looked at your savings account to see its value slashed in half. Almost like magic, $110,000 becomes $55,000 overnight. Around this time, England's economic system fell apart when the South Sea Bubble popped, leading to the financial ruin of everyone from the common laborer to the lords. It happened in Yugoslavia, too, just 13 years ago, and they faced a similar fate. Once an economic success, the country slowly drowned in a sea of unpayable foreign debts. This resulted in sweeping job losses, double-digit inflation, social decay, and civil war. And in the late 1990s, Argentina found itself in trouble as well. Argentines were once able to travel the world and buy luxury goods with their strong currency in hand. But by 2002, debt crushed the country. Their peso became almost worthless, and the once proud citizens were stripped of their dignity, unable to buy even basic staples like beef. Listen, I'm glad you're watching this video, and with the advice I am about to tell you, you'll be able to do like the rich and protect your family's money and well-being. You see, no financial system lasts forever. They all fall apart sooner or later, and when they do, most people suffer. Not all people, but most people. And if you don't want to be wiped out, you have to understand how the process works. But you're probably wondering, who is this guy? What does he know about it? And why should I pay any attention to him? Well, let me tell you a little bit more about myself. My name is Douglas Ehrman. I'm a former investment fund manager from the great state of Minnesota, and I love the United States. I don't live in New York, and I'm not a Wall Street tycoon. But I was once responsible for a portfolio of $100 million in positions, and I was on a team that managed over $1.5 billion. I've been on the inside. I know how the big money acts, how the big money moves, and how fortunes are made by the rich. That's because during my tenure, I made some of my investors very wealthy. But unfortunately, I don't think you were one of them. That's because to invest in my fund, you had to have at least $1 million in investable assets. I'm not saying this to brag or to boast. Don't get me wrong, I'm no financial genius. I'm just an observer. I just happen to have a lot of time to watch, to read, and to think about what is really going on. And I've been able to see some things that others have not. Alan Greenspan, Ben Bernanke, Tim Geithner, along with the heads of almost every major Wall Street bank. None of them saw any problem coming in 2007, but I was ringing every bell I could find. How is it possible for me to see what other smart people don't? Well, part of the answer is that we don't have any motive not to see it. Unlike most people, I'm not going to tell you that everything is going fine, so you'll buy stocks or bonds. I don't want you to vote for me. I'm not looking for a job. And unlike most people, I don't have to worry about how I'm going to earn a living or how I'm going to pay for my retirement. But like a lot of people, maybe you too, I'm very concerned about protecting my family and friends from the trouble ahead. To be more precise about it, I'm very concerned about getting through the crisis with my money intact. If that's a concern for you too, I urge you to keep listening. It will only take a few minutes, but I guarantee you'll walk away from this video with a better understanding of the crisis we face and what to do about it. For example, there's one very simple investment you can make now, which I regard as essential for every person. Normally, it's not something that I would recommend. It's not even investment in the normal sense of the word, but today it's the only sure way to protect yourself. When the financial volcano erupts, almost everything will be blown away. There's only one shelter that you can be sure will still be standing. You can probably guess what it is. But before you rush out and invest in it, there's something you must know. Unless you realize this one critical point, You, along with millions of other amateur investors, will probably lose money on this investment rather than make it. And you'll lose money even though this is probably the most important investment you should make. If your family doesn't have at least 20% of its total wealth in this investment now, you're probably making a big mistake. And yet I can almost guarantee that half the investors who buy this investment now will lose money on it. And that's despite the fact that it will probably be the biggest investment success of the next 20 years. I don't mean to be cagey or mysterious about it. That's just the way it is. And today I want to help investors like you avoid the coming collapse, and specifically I want to help save you and your family's wealth. But let's talk a little more about the disaster that is coming. Then I'll tell you specifically what you can do to make sure your family money is safe. Take a look at this chart. What this chart tells us is what we already knew. People have a lot more debt than they had after World War II. Okay, you might be thinking to yourself, well, so what? The economy is a lot bigger and richer than it used to be. So let's look at the debt level as it compares to the economy itself, the U.S. GDP. This is getting worrying. Debt makes up almost 100% of GDP. But this is just the beginning. There's all kinds of debt, including trillions more in personal, government, and business debt. And then there's the off-the-books debt that the government has built up. The government makes a commitment to fund health care, drugs, retirement benefits, and military spending. It has to come up with the money from somewhere. Sometimes these obligations are funded by tax provisions. Most often they are not. Add in the unfunded obligations, and you get an even worse picture of the debt situation. According to Boston University economics professor Lawrence Kotlikoff, the U.S. fiscal gap is $202 trillion, more than 15 times the official debt. He says this gargantuan discrepancy between our official debt and our actual net indebtedness isn't surprising. It reflects what economists call the labeling problem. Congress has been very careful over the years to label most of its liabilities unofficial, to keep them off the books and far in the future. And now let's look at the real total as it compares to the part of the economy that has to pay the bills, the taxpayer. In 2009, the government only collected $2.15 trillion in tax revenue. So now we see what is really going on and what must happen next. Something's got to give. In other words, the total unfunded debt of the U.S. is more than 100 times the total tax revenue taken in by the government. Something's got to give, in other words. The total unfunded debt of the U.S. is more than 100 times total tax revenue taken in by the government. That means that if the interest rate on the debt were just 5%, it would take 500%, all the 5 times the total tax revenue taken in by the government, just to keep up with it. Obviously, that can't happen. Of course, you could say that some of these obligations are not interest-bearing, but that hardly matters, because those are the ones that are growing fastest. You would hardly believe it. Already the debts and unfunded obligations in the U.S. are far beyond anything we could ever pay off. It is as if you owed 1,000% of your annual income. You would already know that you were headed for bankruptcy. But even with this mountain of debt ahead of us, no one seems to learn. The U.S. Congress is actually adding to the total debt. In the past few years, it added over $2 trillion, more than all the debt incurred by every previous administration. Even the relatively conservative Congressional Budget Office projects U.S. government public debt will hit 716% of GDP by 2080. There is a lot of confusion about the state of U.S. finances. Much of that confusion is intentional. The numbers are frequently twisted for political purposes. For example, if you computed the unemployment rate today the way they did during the Reagan era, we'd have an unemployment rate of 16% today, much higher than the official rate of 8.1%. And the inflation rate would be different too. According to economist John Williams, the real inflation rate today, when calculated like they did when Jimmy Carter was president, is not the 2% the government reports, but around 10%. I'll come back to this in a moment because it helps us understand what is really going on in the economy. But let's stick with the debt for a minute. According to Citigroup, if you calculated U.S. official debt The way it is calculated in Europe, the U.S. would have as much debt as Greece. But at least Greece is trying to do something about it. Here's what Greece is doing to save $38.18 billion through 2012. Increasing taxes on alcohol 20% and cigarettes by 60%. Increasing the value-added tax, VAT, by 4%. Freezing pensions. Imposing tighter retirement rules, like making the retirement age for women 65 to match the age for men. And by cutting public sector pay and bonuses. And the U.S.? Well, the U.S. is still firmly committed to increasing its government spending. Both Democrats and Republicans agree that they ought to cut the deficits, but they can't agree on how to do it. In the tax deal made in Congress, for example, the Democrats wanted to increase taxes. The Republicans wanted to decrease spending. The result? You already know what happened. The politicians chose the worst possible solution. They neither raised taxes nor cut spending. In other words, they let the deficits get worse than ever. Here's what the deficits look like. Continuing on this path will add over $10 trillion to the official national debt over the next 9 years. Pretty amazing, isn't it? And now let's do some simple math. Begin with the total net worth of the country, the value of all the bank accounts, businesses, real estate, cars, everything in the nation. $72.6 trillion from National Debt Clock. Now let's see how much that is per person. So we divide by 310,232,863, CIA Factbook. This is the total wealth per person, $234,017. Now let's take the total debt figure, public, private, official, and off-the-books unfunded liabilities, like Medicare and Social Security, according to Lawrence Kotlikoff of Boston University. $202 trillion. And now let's divide that by the population. $651,123. Do you see what I see? Of course you do. Subtract the debt from the assets, and you get a wealth per person of minus $417,106.80. In other words, the average American is in the hole by $417,106.80. He's broke. He's busted. And the whole nation is busted too, because on average, every man, woman, and child is underwater. People talk about the U.S. going bankrupt someday in the future. The fact is, the country is already bankrupt. The only question is how this bankruptcy is expressed. What happens when people figure out that the debt is bad and who bears the loss? I will tell you right up front. I don't know the answers to those questions. No one does. Not exactly. Not for sure. But one thing you can be sure of, those losses are not going to magically disappear. Millions of people are not going to get what they've been promised, or what they expect. Who? Investors, who bought stocks figuring they will go up in the 2010s like they did in the 80s or 90s. Lenders who gave money to the U.S. or state and local governments expecting to earn a decent return on their savings. Savers who put money into banks or insurance programs. Retirees who were counting on pensions or Social Security. Speculators who bet they could make money by gambling that the trends of the near future will be like those of the recent past. We can't be quite sure who will take the loss or when. But we know there are trillions of dollars worth of losses to be shared out, and based on examples from history, we can make some pretty good guesses about who will be stuck with them. Look, here's my main message to you. In the mid-2000s, I saw the private sector headed for disaster. I said so. I warned friends, family, and clients to take cover. Now I'm out of the world of money management, and I'm giving any fellow Americans who will listen another warning. This time, I'm not warning about a stock market collapse or a liquidity crisis. I'm warning you. The big one is coming, the total breakdown of U.S. dollar financial system, hyperinflationary chaos, along with the utter destruction of the U.S. financial system. And I'm not the only one who sees it coming. Here are the words of David Stockman, former chief of the Office of Management and Budget under Ronald Reagan. The Fed is destroying prosperity. We are coming near the edge of where that can continue to remain stable. Here's what Representative Ron Paul has to say on the matter. What's happening is there's transfer of wealth from the poor and the middle class to the wealthy. When you inflate a currency or destroy a currency, the middle class gets wiped out, so the people who get to use the money first, which is created by the Federal Reserve System, benefit. So the money gravitates to the banks and to Wall Street. And here are the words of Paul Craig Roberts, former Wall Street Journal editor and Assistant Secretary to the Treasury, also in the Reagan administration. The American empire is on the rocks, despite its vast arsenal of nuclear weapons and its control over the foreign and domestic policies of its subservient puppet states. These people are not cranks. They are not alarmists. They are not extremists. They are just telling it as it is. But that's not all there is to it. Not by a long shot. You see, the money is important, but it's not just a matter of money. The financial system that was set up after World War II was dominated by the U.S. and the U.S. dollar, because the U.S. was by far the most powerful economy in the world, with every possible advantage in its favor. The most obvious was that while most of its competitors had bombed out factories, those of America were still intact and more productive than ever. And that's not all. It also had the latest, most advanced technology, most of the world's savings, a huge trade surplus, a young and growing population. And though the nation still had big debts from the war, almost immediately after the war, it began running government budget surpluses. Since then, the situation has totally turned around. The U.S. has lost approximately 42,400 factories since 2001. Approximately 75% of those factories employed at least 500 workers. The U.S. has lost more than 30% of its manufacturing jobs since 2000. Manufacturing jobs in the U.S. computer industry is lower in 2010 than it was in 1975, when computers were first coming on the market. According to a study by Thomson Reuters, China could become the global leader in patent filings by next year. The U.S. is no longer the innovation hub and tech king it once was. And think about this. The U.S. now has the most debts of any nation on earth, 20 times as much debt as its nearest rival. It has the biggest trade deficit of any nation, over $497.8 billion. The U.S. trade deficit was about $40 or $50 billion a month last year. That means a little less than $500 billion has left the U.S. and won't be coming back. Its population is still growing, but only at a 0.9% rate. More disturbing, when you take into account illegal immigrants who are now returning home, the U.S. actually has a net out migration. More people are leaving the U.S. than coming to it. And since the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, the U.S. dollar has lost over 95% of its purchasing power. And you might be interested in these stats, too. For the first time in history, banks own a greater share of residential housing net worth than individuals do. In February of last year, there were 5.5 unemployed Americans for every job opening. U.S. law enforcement authorities claim that there are now over 1 million members of criminal gangs inside the country. These 1 million gang members are responsible for up to 80% of the crimes committed in the United States each year. In 1959, manufacturing represented 28% of all U.S. economic output. In 2008, it represented 11.5%. 10 years ago, the U.S. was number one in average wealth per adult. In 2010, the U.S. ranked 7th. The U.S. has the third worst poverty rate among the advanced nations tracked by the OECD. You don't have to be an economist to read the handwriting on this wall. The U.S. is losing its place in the world. Between 2000 and 2009, America's trade deficit with China shot up 300%. Today, the U.S. spends approximately $3.90 on Chinese goods for every $1 that China spends on U.S. goods. By 2040, the Chinese economy could be 3 times as big as the U.S. economy. The U.S. is no longer in a position to control the world's money or its economies, so when the inevitable crisis comes, it will be powerless to do anything about it. Its old friends and enemies will all turn against it. They will dump U.S. bonds and refuse to lend more. They will sell dollars and create a new monetary system based on new money. It's no coincidence that gold and silver prices have soared over the past 10 years. Already, a secret meeting was held. Countries like China and Russia have called for a new world reserve currency. Even Dominique Strauss-Kahn, former head of the International Monetary Fund, believes that it's healthy to explore these kinds of ideas now. Jim Rogers, one of the world's most successful investors, writes, "The dollar is not just in decline, it's a mess. If something isn't done soon, I believe the dollar could lose its status as the world's reserve currency and medium of exchange, something that would lead to a huge decline in the standard of living for U.S. citizens like nothing we've seen in nearly a century." None of these are wild predictions. They are what always happens when a monetary system cracks up and a great power rolls over. And this is the good news. It could be much worse. The U.S. has military bases in 120 different countries. It has made enemies all over the globe. And soon it will find that it can no longer afford to continue policing the world. Would it surprise you if some of those old enemies take advantage of America's weakness, not just financially, but politically and militarily? What I'm saying is that we can foresee the financial consequences. These things have happened many times before. The other consequences are harder to anticipate. The last major empire to lose power was Great Britain. It had the good fortune to turn over power to a friendly rival, the U.S. Even so, it took 2 world wars and 97 million casualties before the handover of power was completed. The British pound lost 70% of its value. Britain went off the gold standard 4 times. The country almost defaulted on its debt 2 times, in 1917 and 1932. It was only saved from outright bankruptcy after World War II because the U.S. bailed it out with the Marshall Plan, and the IMF bailed it out with a £2.3 billion loan in 1976. Now it's America's turn. What I am saying to you is that you face huge dangers. Some are predictable, some are not. And if you want to survive, you'll need someone in your corner that will explain the situation as it really is. So what should you do to protect and possibly even grow your wealth in the next few years? I believe there are some simple moves you should begin making, starting immediately. But keep this in mind. I'm talking just about what to do with your money. Physically protecting your family, that's a whole other matter, and it depends a lot on which state you live, and if you live in a city or a suburb, and a whole host of other factors. One thing I can recommend for everyone is to secure a place you can go if things get bad and rioters take to the streets. This could happen this year. Wherever you're going to wait out the chaos, I think it makes sense to stockpile the basics: food, water, and medical supplies. And these should last you at least 3 months. Remember, you can't count on the government during this coming crisis. If the government couldn't save New Orleans during Katrina, how can they save you if the whole nation breaks down? And as I said earlier, the truth is, the government won't even try to save individual American citizens. The government, the Federal Reserve, and the politicians in Washington will be much more concerned with saving themselves. As far as protecting your money and using the coming crisis to increase your wealth, that's where I can help you. Everything I am going to recommend in this video is number 1, simple, and number 2, easily implemented, at least at this time. But if you wait to do these things, however, they will almost certainly get very expensive, difficult, and even impossible to do. Who knows what kind of anti-capitalist crackdowns could occur if things get bad. That's why I encourage you to do what I recommend now. Not only will you be better prepared to weather the coming storm, I believe you could also make quite a bit of money over the next few years. But what if I'm wrong about all of this? Here's the good news. I think you'll still make excellent gains with minimal amounts of risk. Even if we escape this crisis, in low or mild inflation, you will still be set up to do very well. So here are the specific steps you should take. I've already started to prepare my own portfolio and the portfolios of my friends and family, and today I'd like to help investors like you. I've put together a new report that outlines a low-risk disaster plan you can put into action today, and I'd like to send it to you for free. It's called How to Protect Yourself and Prosper in the Coming Global Crisis. The list price is $29.99, but it's yours free. This in-depth report outlines the 4-part action plan on how to protect yourself and your family. But more than just protection, it offers unique and interesting ways to make yourself a handsome fortune when this crisis comes to town. No mainstream analyst will provide this kind of insight. No politician will dare mention it, especially during an election year. But if you're the person I think you are, you'll benefit from taking these smart steps now, before it's too late. Part 1. Learn this income secret now and create a big second paycheck. What if this crisis causes you to lose your job? I think there's a very good chance of that happening. In my research, these economic breakdowns always produce sweeping job losses. So what will you do then? How will you feed your family, pay health care, pay your mortgage? If you're looking for a way to make big income, passively and from the comfort of your own home, I encourage you to keep watching. This money-making second income strategy works best in times of big stock market swings, volatility in other words. When are the big swings? In times of crisis, real or perceived. One colleague I know used this strategy to make 35% gains in the first 3 months of last year. Not bad. When the crisis hits, it's easy for smart investors to potentially make between $1,000 and $5,000 per month once they learn this low-risk strategy. And remember, this has nothing to do with buying or selling stocks. In fact, you don't even need a traditional brokerage account to take advantage of it. Though keep in mind, this strategy is not for everyone, but for the types of investors that can understand this strategy, you can make serious money, fast. And, like I said, it works best in times of financial uncertainty. But you could also use it right now, so I encourage you to learn how it works. If you're interested in learning this secret plus much more, please continue watching this video. In just a moment, I'll show you how to get your free copy of How to Protect Yourself and Prosper in the Coming Global Crisis. But before I do, I want to let you in on step 2 of this plan. Part number 2, the U.S. government, the U.S. military, even Apple needs these rare commodities to survive. Here's how to buy them now. If you're watching this video, you've probably already started making some steps towards securing your family's future by investing in precious metals like gold and silver. If you haven't, I encourage you to go to your nearest precious metals dealer. The smartest, most financially savvy investors in the world have already made big moves into gold and silver for protection. Billionaires like George Soros, Seth Klarman, John Paulson, the man who made $4 billion when the mortgage crisis hit, just to name a few. While owning gold right now is a safe investment, I believe the big money, the 640% gains, like we've seen over the past decade, have already been made. So while gold gives you safety and limited risk, I don't think the metal will hit $4,000 per ounce like some analysts are predicting. So how can we make even bigger gains during the crisis? I've discovered one commodity investment that is as much a sure bet as I can find right now and could promise even greater returns than gold over the coming years ahead. According to the reputable Absolute Wealth newsletter, investing in these minerals will make patient investors millionaires in a few years, like oil investments in 1970s benefited later. Let me explain. This Colorado company has developed a specialized way to pull a strategically important mineral out of the ground. A mineral that literally every large high-tech manufacturer, every water treatment company, every army, and even every government in the world needs right now. If the world economy collapses and inflation takes off like I am predicting, some industries might collapse. That should be obvious. But at the same time, some companies will do very, very well. This company is one of them. And right now, it's selling for bargain basement prices. If my predictions are correct, this stock could potentially be a 10-bagger once the crisis hits. You could potentially turn a modest $1,000 investment into $10,000, quickly and easily. I explain everything in How to Protect Yourself and Prosper in the Coming Global Crisis. Plus, I'd like to send you the information on part number 3, a backdoor way to get in on the coming agriculture boom and make explosive profits. The next step in my crisis plan is to buy productive farmland. It's the surest bet in a crisis. As the old-timers say, never sell the land, son. It's been there in the past, and it'll be there for thousands of years to come. Plus, you can grow food on it. If things get really bad, and if prices of vegetables and fruit get as expensive as I think they will. Billionaire investor and hedge fund legend Sam Diggle says agriculture could be the single most interest opportunity over the next 10 to 20 years. Being long stuff in the ground is going to be a better place to be than holding pieces of paper. I think he's dead right. But of course, I understand not everyone has the time, experience, know-how, or money to buy a piece of farmland. So I've uncovered a way to get in on it, the next best way. A backdoor way to make explosive profits. Even when inflation takes off, every farm in the world is going to need fertilizer. It's a valuable, must-have commodity. Just ask anyone that's ever worked on a farm. And I'm targeting a unique way to buy this stuff. One unknown company I'm following right now, it makes about $700 million a year in revenue. It's not a mainstream name, not at all. Farmers probably know it, but the mainstream media is totally clueless. But that's not the main reason I like this company. You see, I like it for another unique reason. The type of fertilizer it produces is nitrogen-based. You know what else nitrogen is used for? Dynamite. I don't mean to sound cagey here, but if things go as I am predicting they will do, the people that have the weapons, they will have the power. If you already own a firearm, a piece of this company is a great addition to your arsenal in times of crisis and could potentially make you explosive 100 to 200 profits in the years ahead. Imagine potentially turning a small $2,500 investment into $5,000, maybe even $7,500. It's all in your new free report, How to Protect Yourself and Prosper in the Coming Global Crisis, which I'll show you how to get in the next 3 minutes. But first, let me get to the 4th financial step I recommend you to take right now. Step number 4. Buy this asset when there's blood in the streets. When things turn south, there will be a period of serious civic and international unrest. The Occupy Wall Street movement, the Arab Spring, the protests in Montreal, Greece, and Spain, these are just the tip of the iceberg. You'll see more and more people taking to the streets, not just in big cities across the world, but in your town, too. You'll see riot police, maybe even the National Guard. But that doesn't mean there isn't opportunity when it happens. Baron Rothschild, an 18th century nobleman and key figure of the Rothschild banking family, said, "The time to buy is when there's blood in the streets." And he's one to know. He made himself a fortune buying in the panic that followed the Battle of Waterloo against Napoleon. But even that isn't the whole story. The original quote is believed to be, "Buy when there's blood in the streets, even if the blood is your own." When things are going bad, and if you stick to your guns and buy when everyone is fearful, that's when you'll find the best opportunities for profit. So how can we make money when everyone is scared? I've uncovered a company that's ready to take advantage of the next blood in the streets moment. It's a small company, but it makes an important product, one that all armies around the world rely on. It's not Boeing, it's not Lockheed Martin, it's not any company covered by the mainstream media or Wall Street investment houses. This company is much smaller. That's why I like it. Almost no one has heard of it, but it's a crucial piece of every army's puzzle. And that's what makes this such an exciting opportunity to get in on now. I think investors that buy this company now could reasonably expect 50 to 75% gains in the years ahead. To get part 4 of my plan, and much more, I urge you to claim your new free report, How to Protect Yourself and Prosper in the Coming Global Crisis. If you wait, even a few months, many of the opportunities I outline in this report might not be available. So to get this new report, all I ask is that you take a risk-free look at my investment advisory. It's called 21st Century Commodity Millionaire. You see, I believe what's coming will reward investors holding real, hard assets. Assets like precious metals, oil, gas, property, farmland, and rock-solid dividend-paying stocks in those kinds of companies. Not risky investments like mortgage-backed securities, complicated financial products, highly leveraged ETFs, or anything else Wall Street has dreamt up. Growing populations across the world are contributing to our need for energy, food, housing, and other goods, which are reliant on natural resources. From a portfolio perspective, the appeal of commodities stems from my research on the historical data. This asset class has helped investors profit during centuries of crisis with minimal risk. In every issue of 21st Century Commodity Millionaire, I share with you investment ideas in the commodity sector that no one else is showing you. And these aren't for your everyday metal and oil stocks. What makes my advisory unique is that we target companies using new technology to extract metals, oil and gas, and other minerals and commodities. In fact, one Pennsylvania mechanic who tapped into these new mining technologies made $900,000 overnight. Through the 21st Century Commodity Millionaire, I help you stay on the cutting edge of global trends in commodity investing, get rich without being a super scientist or an engineer, and I help you generate excellent returns with limited amount of risk. Did you know a new company in Seattle is developing new technology to mine mineral-rich asteroids this decade? The co-founder of one of the companies I'm targeting said, "There are $20 trillion checks up there waiting to be cashed." Another company is developing ways to mine the moon, which is rich in platinum, a commodity priced at around $1,500 per ounce. And those are just two names on my radar. I also track companies that use fracking technology to drill places like the Marcellus shale fields in Ohio and the Bakken Formation in North Dakota. I'm also looking into new technology that makes deepwater oil and gas plays off the coast of Brazil, Mexico, Israel, and even Angola and Namibia off the coast of Africa. Very exciting. Let me tell you a little about one of the most promising money-making opportunities I am following right now. You can decide if the money-making returns I outline in my advisory are for you. Did you know that ExxonMobil found 3.3 billion barrels in Block 15 in Angola? Petrobras struck black gold there 4,921 feet below sea level. BP made 10 discoveries in the ultra-deep water, and French-owned Total found oil in Block 1706, and that Angola is the largest producer in Africa. Production there is about 2 million barrels per day. That's nearly the same as Kuwait, and that number will skyrocket 50% over the next 4 years. Sure enough, while most investors sat on their hands, the investors who spotted this trend early and invested big would have made life-changing profits. Since 2001, here's how a few companies with operations in Angola have done. ExxonMobil shot up 105.5%. Total Energy exploded by 79.9%. And Petrobras shot up more than 600%. That's why I'm tracking a Brazilian company that has its eyes on the oil-rich coast of Africa. It will make my subscribers very rich. This company is sitting on an estimated 37.35 billion barrels of oil and natural gas, worth $373 billion. Of course, finding this oil takes lots of money, and oil's trading around $100 a barrel as I write this. So let's say, worst-case scenario, even if the company only makes $2 per barrel after the costs, 37.35 billion barrels would give his company an estimated book value of $74.7 billion. Now divide the book value by the number of shares this company has outstanding, 5.5 million. And that works out to show the company's current value could be about $8,427 per share, for a company whose shares have been trading in the $800 range. Do you see the value here? You could make life-changing returns of 895% from this tiny, undervalued company. By my estimation, it could turn a small $10,000 investment into $89,500 if everything goes according to plan. And this is just one of the newest ideas I'm following, and I'll share with you every month in 21st Century Commodity Millionaire. If I were to charge you my normal fee for this type of hedge fund style research, you'd have to normally invest $500,000 to $1 million in my funds. But today you can have access to this level of institutional research for much less. But I have to tell you, I am scared right now. I'm worried that hardworking Americans like you are going to get wiped out when this crisis strikes. That's why I created this video. And that's why I'd like to send you the full details on exactly how this is going to unfold, and exactly how to protect yourself and make big money during this crisis. Remember, the U.S. government can't and won't save you. You can either let things happen to you, or you can take a few simple steps and change your family's fate. Please, just give the research I've done a look, and I believe you will have the information you need at your disposal. The best part is, you can take a look at my work and receive the report I mentioned today at absolutely no risk or obligation. Simply let me know you'd like to take a trial subscription to my monthly newsletter, and I will immediately give you access to how to protect yourself and prosper in the coming global crisis. But that's not all. I've also put together another valuable report to help you ride out the coming crisis in peace. And I'd like to send it to you free for the next 7 days only. It's called 7 Hard Asset Investments to Buy and Hold Forever. Deciding you want to invest in commodities is a good first step to protecting your wealth and your family. However, the investment vehicles available can be a bit frightening, if not downright overwhelming at first glance. For many investors, even experts, commodity futures markets and ETFs are confusing. I'm here to help you. In this report, I outline in plain English 7 hard asset safe havens to preserve capital as well as appreciate in times of crisis and inflation. And that's not all. When you sign up for a risk-free trial and your free reports, I'll also keep you up to date every month on exactly what's going on regarding this coming financial crisis. I'll show you ways to make money now and as it happens. When you sign up today, you'll also get password-protected access to the Investment Underground Digital Archive. We will email you your password, and you'll be free to explore the full archive. That's where you'll find thousands of ideas and stock picks on commodities, gold and silver, real estate, and other money-making investment plays I've been tracking, plus the valuable economic research my colleagues at investmentunderground.com have done over the years. So how much does it all cost, and how can you get started? A 1-year subscription to 21st Century Commodity Millionaire, including everything I've mentioned here, normally costs $199 per year. But right now, you can try my research for 1/4 the normal rate. You'll just pay $49.75 for an entire year. That's 75% off. But why such a discount? 2 reasons. I'm really worried about the state America's economy is in right now, and I want to warn as many people as possible, but I also need to run a business. And my business only works when I have loyal subscribers. At the same time, I understand that not everyone has heard of me, or the research I've done as a money manager and published writer. And that's why through this video, I'm making it so cheap. You can try out my research and learn about the coming crisis risk-free. I'm giving you 4 months to take a look at the research reports I've just described, plus the next 4 issues of my newsletter. If, after 4 months, you decide for any reason my work is not right for you, just let me know by phone or email, and you can receive a full refund, and keep everything you've received so far. In other words, with this offer, you're agreeing only to simply try out my work to see if you like it. I hope you'll consider this offer. The stakes have never been higher. To get started, simply click on the link below, which will take you to a secure order form. Your order will be processed quickly, and you'll have access to all this information in a matter of minutes. Thanks for watching.